Now, 2 beavers have been released into the wild in England after the government approved their reintroduction. Conservationists say beavers' love of...
They released hundreds of beavers into a broken, eroded Yellowstone. Where the land was dry, the streams ran wild, and the wetlands had nearly vanished.
Every summer, millions of people visit Yellowstone National Park hoping for a spotting right, the beloved destination.
It sounded like a strange solution. Beavers? In a national park that desperately needed healing? But what happened next was wild. The dams went up, the water slowed down, and suddenly nature started fixing itself in ways no one imagined. This was a full-blown ecological reset. What made beavers the unexpected heroes of Yellowstone? And how did their comeback rewrite the future of an entire national park? Let's find out. Yellowstone, before the comeback. Right now, Yellowstone is known for its beautiful rivers, green wetlands, and the kind of postcard landscapes that make people want to hike or post it on Instagram. But rewind to the 1940s, and the picture looked very different. Those same areas that now overflow with life used to be dry, cracked floodplains. The small streams barely trickled, the banks were eroding, plant life was struggling, and biodiversity was almost non-existent. It was a fading ecosystem. The rivers had lost their flow, and nature was slowly collapsing. Something had to give. Between 1986 and 1999, over 100 beavers were reintroduced into Yellowstone National Park. It wasn't exactly front-page news at the time, but this quiet move would reshape the park in the most dramatic way. These little animals, often underestimated, became essential to the ecosystem's revival. Beavers build dams, which slow down water, spread it across the landscape, and create wetlands. This gives rise to new plant life, attracts insects, birds, amphibians, and everything in between. Water stays longer in the system, and the soil holds together. Life follows water, and the beavers knew exactly how to bring it back. But the full story isn't just about beavers. It gets more complicated when you add wolves, elk, willows, and human error. At one point, Yellowstone had a normal, stable population of wolves. They were an important part of the natural balance. But then came people, and with them came fear. Wolves were seen as threats, either to humans or to livestock, and the reaction was simple: kill them. There was no deeper thought about the role wolves played in the ecosystem. It was all about getting rid of a predator. From 1915 to 1923, more than 4 wolves were killed every year in Yellowstone, according to wildlife biologist Adolphe Mourier, who examined the park ranger's records from that era. Some years, the number climbed into the double digits. By 1924, wolves had been wiped out from the park entirely. Between 1924 and 1935, not a single wolf was documented there. They were gone, and once they were gone, the entire system started breaking down. Without wolves to keep them in check, elk populations exploded. These animals usually face constant pressure from predators like wolves, cougars, and bears, which helps limit their numbers and keeps them moving. But without wolves, they grew bold. They lingered in one place too long, overgrazing young plants, especially willow and aspen. Riparian zones, those lush areas around rivers and streams, were hit the hardest. Elk would chew down every shoot trying to grow, stopping forests and shrubs from regenerating. It didn't take long before entire sections of Yellowstone looked barren and worn out. The elk weren't villains, they were just doing what came naturally. The problem was that the system that used to control them no longer existed. And that's when the idea of bringing wolves back started to gain traction. In 1995, the US government reintroduced wolves into Yellowstone. It was a controversial move, met with resistance from local ranchers and others who still believed wolves were dangerous. But ecologists knew something had to be done to reset the park's failing ecosystem. The wolves didn't waste time. Once they returned, they started hunting elk again. But more importantly, their presence alone changed elk behavior. The elk stopped camping out in the open meadows and riverbanks where they were easy targets. They moved more frequently, giving vegetation a chance to grow again. This created a domino effect. With fewer elk chewing down willow and aspen, those plants started growing back. With more plant cover came more insects, birds, and small mammals. And with all that new life came the beavers. Beavers build it back. The beavers didn't just benefit from the new growth, they accelerated it. As willows came back along the riverbanks, beavers moved in to build their dams. These dams slowed the water, spread it out, and rehydrated the landscape. More ponds formed, which became home to frogs, fish, and nesting birds. Streams that once looked like broken veins became active again. Water flowed differently, soil erosion slowed down. Wetlands expanded. And slowly the ecosystem that had been collapsing began to rebuild itself. Wolves and beavers didn't plan to save Yellowstone, but together they sparked a process that reshaped the park. Wolves controlled the elk, which allowed plants to return. Beavers used those plants to engineer a water-rich landscape, and that wetland landscape brought back biodiversity. The balance in Yellowstone used to rely on a quiet but powerful relationship between wolves and elk. Wolves hunted elk, so the elk were constantly on the move. They didn't overgraze one place because staying in one spot too long made them easy targets. This natural pressure helped the plants recover and kept the landscape in a healthy rotation. The elk couldn't afford to get too comfortable. But when wolves were eliminated from Yellowstone in the 1920s, everything shifted. Without that predator threat, elk behavior changed fast. There was no longer a reason to wander. Instead of grazing lightly and moving on, they settled into one area and fed on everything in sight. They weren't just growing in numbers, they were becoming destructive. Scientists later realized that the elk had completely changed how they interacted with the environment. They were no longer cautious and mobile. They had become overconfident and lazy, and their feeding habits reflected that. Instead of sharing the space with the ecosystem, they were overwhelming it. They devoured young trees and shrubs before they had any chance to grow back. The plants didn't stand a chance. Among the plants that suffered the most were the willows. These shrubs play a critical role in the riverbanks and wetlands of Yellowstone. They're strong, adaptable, and grow in areas that other trees can't. But more importantly, they're essential to another species that was quietly holding the waterways together, beavers. Willows are everything to beavers. They're food, shelter, and building material. Without them, beavers can't build dams. And without dams, water doesn't stay in one place long enough to nourish the land. Back in 1921, when wolves were still keeping elk on the move and willows were thriving, there were 25 known beaver colonies in Yellowstone. But by 1953, that number had dropped to 8. This wasn't a coincidence. With wolves gone, elk were free to graze wherever they pleased, and they hit the willows hard. In some areas, they ate entire patches down to the roots. The beavers couldn't survive without their key resource. Their shelters disappeared. Their food supply vanished. Slowly, they abandoned those areas or died out. Even outside Yellowstone, beavers had already been pushed to the edge. The decline wasn't just about local changes. It was happening across the continent. Before European settlers arrived in North America, there were an estimated 60 million beavers across the region. But as colonists moved in, they hunted beavers aggressively for their pelts, which were used to make hats and other fashionable items in Europe. This led to a devastating crash in population. By the early 20th century, only about 10 million beavers remained. So when the conditions in Yellowstone turned hostile, when elk were wiping out the willows and the rivers were losing their structure, beavers didn't have the numbers or resources to fight back. They weren't migrating in from other areas. They were simply vanishing. The decline in willows wasn't just bad for beavers. It signaled a bigger collapse. Willows stabilize the soil, filter the water, and provide shade and food for countless other animals. When they disappeared, the streams began to erode. The soil loosened, the wetlands dried out, and everything that relied on that cycle, birds, insects, fish, frogs, started to disappear with it. The whole ecosystem began to unravel, one plant at a time. Wolves return, and so does the pressure. Some researchers believe that the North American beaver population dropped so low it may have hit just 100,000 individuals at one point. That's an almost total collapse from the estimated million that once roamed the continent. So while beavers weren't fully extinct, they were far too few to bounce back on their own, especially in places like Yellowstone, where the environment had turned against them. The landscape wasn't just tough, it was practically unlivable. The willows had been destroyed by the elk, and without those trees, the beavers had no way to build dams, no shelter, and no food. Even if a small group of them tried to return, they couldn't survive in an area where their main resources were already wiped out. In 1995, Yellowstone finally took a step toward fixing the damage. 14 grey wolves were brought into the park from Canada. The following year, another 17 wolves arrived. With that, the balance started to shift. Elk began to move again. They spread out and stopped grazing in one spot for too long. It wasn't immediate, but the pattern was familiar. The wolves were reintroducing pressure that had been missing for decades. As the elk began roaming again, the willows slowly started to return. The change wasn't dramatic at first, but it was steady. Plants that hadn't had a chance to grow for decades were now getting a second shot. Beavers finally had a reason to come back. But even with wolves doing their part, the damage Yellowstone had already suffered wasn't going to reverse overnight. Years of human impact had taken a heavy toll. Trails, roads, and park activities had pushed into natural areas, and some of the park's most biodiverse regions were already in decline by the time the wolves were brought in. By the 1990s, many of Yellowstone's small waterways weren't doing well. Stream banks had been eroded by a combination of animal overgrazing and a lack of plant roots to hold the soil together. The shorelines were often dry, and the vegetation that used to grow there had either died or lost most of its diversity. That meant fewer flowers, fewer shrubs, and fewer sheltering spots for wildlife. These changes didn't just hurt beavers. A wide range of insects, amphibians, and birds depend on healthy streams to survive. Some use them as nesting grounds, others for food. When the habitat shifted or disappeared completely, so did many of these species. The food chain got weaker, biodiversity shrank. Fish were next. When water flows change, fish are often the first to feel the impact. Many species need cool, slow-moving streams to breed and feed. Without beaver dams to control water levels and slow things down, the streams ran faster, warmer, and shallower than before. Spawning areas dried up. The underwater plants that provided cover disappeared. Insects that fish rely on for food began to vanish. As fish populations dropped, so did the animals that relied on them. Otters, birds, and even bears were affected. The ripple effect moved through the ecosystem, touching every level. All of this was connected. Wolves weren't just killing elk. They were helping restore an entire system by forcing animals to act more naturally. And once the pressure came back, life began to rebuild itself. One plant, one dam, and one stream at a time. The water was getting too warm. Even after the wolves were reintroduced, it wasn't enough to fully repair Yellowstone's ecosystem. The water temperatures were rising, making it hard for certain fish, especially salmon, to survive. Salmon are cold water fish, and once those temperatures go up past a certain point, their ability to breathe, reproduce, and move properly all starts to break down. It's not just about comfort for them, it's about survival. At the same time, bird species that once filled the riversides had thinned out. They couldn't just bounce back because the elk were finally moving again. The wolves helped, but it was clear that Yellowstone needed more than just predators to fix everything. The scientists started comparing data, reviewing patterns, and eventually landed on a conclusion. The park also needed the return of its original ecosystem engineers, the beavers. It didn't happen all at once. There were no dramatic arrivals. Instead, help came in quiet waves. From 1986 to 1999, Yellowstone began receiving beavers every single year from Gallatin National Forest, located just north of the park. It was a long-term effort that didn't make headlines, but had an enormous impact. Over those 13 years, scientists introduced a total of 129 beavers into different parts of Yellowstone. These relocations weren't just for show. They were a lifeline for the park's collapsing creek systems. According to the National Park Service, by 1996, before the entire reintroduction program was even finished, 49 new beaver colonies had already been recorded. That meant something was working. The conditions were finally starting to support them again. Willows were coming back. The elk weren't trampling every shrub into the ground because wolves had forced them to keep moving. And once the environment started to stabilize, the beavers began doing what they do best, transforming everything around them. A follow-up study in 2007 confirmed what scientists had suspected. The number of beaver colonies had more than doubled, reaching 127 in just over a decade. By that point, researchers didn't need spreadsheets to understand what was happening. All they had to do was look at the rivers. Waterways that had dried out or become too warm were now filling back up. Vegetation was growing in places where it hadn't existed for years. The beavers were reshaping Yellowstone. In fact, calling them engineers doesn't quite do them justice. They weren't just building structures, they were reviving entire ecosystems from the ground up. Here's what makes beavers so important. Every time they build a dam, they block a stream or river just enough to slow the water down. This causes a pond to form. It sounds simple, but that pond becomes a magnet for life. Over time, those ponds evolve into wetlands, a kind of super habitat that supports a huge range of animals. Frogs, fish, insects, birds, deer, moose, they all benefit. Researchers estimate that wetlands created by beaver dams, even though they only cover small patches of land, support 70 to 80% of all species at some point in their life cycle. That includes nesting, feeding, breeding, and migration stops. It's an incredible number. So when a single beaver colony sets up shop and gets to work, it's not just making a home for itself, it's shaping the future of everything around it. The impact is massive, and it's visible. Streams that once rushed through dry valleys now move slower and wider. Pools form, vegetation returns, water temperatures drop, and species that had vanished start to show up again. It's the kind of recovery that doesn't need a human blueprint, just enough space and time for the beavers to do what they've always done. Dams were dying out. When beavers nearly disappeared from Yellowstone, the signs were everywhere. A few dams were still scattered around, but they weren't doing much. Without enough beavers to maintain them, those structures couldn't function properly, and the landscape reflected it. Wetlands were shrinking, the streams were moving too fast. The entire balance of the park was thrown off. Then, in 1986, biologists began bringing the rodents back. It started slow, but by the mid-90s, something clicked. The wolves returned in 1995, pushing the elk back from the stream banks. And the willows, plants beavers depend on to build and survive, began to grow again. That combination finally gave the beavers a fighting chance. The number of dams increased, and with the dams came the comeback of wetlands, streams, and biodiversity. Yellowstone didn't just get wetter, it got greener. Wetlands are basically hotspots of life, and once beaver activity picked up again, the change was obvious. Areas that had dried out were suddenly covered with grasses, shrubs, and young trees. Even the edges of the waterways began to look different. They weren't just barren channels anymore, they were complex ecosystems. There's something else those slow-moving beaver ponds do. Unlike fast-flowing streams, which barely soak into the ground, still water from beaver dams seeps downward, refilling underground water supplies. This groundwater recharge becomes especially important during dry seasons. It creates a kind of natural water reserve that helps the land, the animals, and even humans. And willows, they were made for this. Their roots can tap into that deep groundwater, which means once beavers return and build dams, willows have everything they need to thrive. Those muddy shores that form around beaver ponds become perfect real estate for these plants. They anchor the soil, support insects and birds, and give beavers an ongoing supply of building materials. It's a cycle that feeds itself. One dam leads to more water, more willows, more habitat, and more beavers. Back when wolves were wiped out and elk numbers spiraled out of control, the willows took the brunt of it. elk fed on the young shoots aggressively, grazing until the plants couldn't recover. At the same time, beavers were almost gone, which meant no dams, no ponds, and no suitable growing spots for willows. But once the elk were pushed back by wolves, and beavers returned to reshape the land, the willows finally got their shot at a comeback, and they didn't waste it. The thickets became denser, healthier, and more widespread. They weren't just clinging to life anymore, they were taking over the stream banks again. A 2018 study looked closely at what changed. Researchers focused on Blacktail Deer Creek in northern Yellowstone. In 1995, the area was in bad shape. Hardly any vegetation near the water, but things started shifting fast. By 2018, vegetation cover near the creek reached 43% on the west side and an incredible 93% on the east side. That's not just improvement, that's recovery. Willows, in particular, saw major growth. By 2017, the number of willow plants had increased dramatically compared to the pre-beaver, pre-wolf days. And they weren't just spreading, they were growing taller. The average height ranged anywhere from 20 to 78 inches, which was a huge leap from earlier decades. The research keeps going. Park researchers didn't stop at counting trees. They kept tracking how beavers were affecting the entire landscape. One biologist explains that beaver ponds aren't just places where wetlands form, they're critical habitats for fish like salmon. Yellowstone's waterways, once damaged and less inviting, had pushed salmon to seek other spawning grounds. But beaver ponds offer the perfect environment for salmon to swim in from the salty ocean and reproduce. The water stays cool, which salmon need to thrive. Without the right conditions, these fish wouldn't bother coming to Yellowstone at all. The ponds also provide shelter from the sun, thanks to plants like willows that hang their branches low, shading young salmon from harsh rays. These shady spots create a safer space for the fish to grow. Salmon aren't the only ones benefiting from beaver ponds. These wetlands become homes for otters, minks, marsh birds, waterfowl, and countless insects. Mosquitoes use the ponds to lay their larvae, creating a complex food web. In many ways, beavers act like natural builders who turn ordinary streams into bustling dormitories full of life. These places become hotspots of biodiversity, where many species live side by side. Because of all this, it's easy to see why beavers are often called nature's little heroes. Thanks to their dams, the local streams and creeks have come back to life, supporting a variety of plants and animals. But beavers do more than just help with water and wildlife. They also play an unexpected role in protecting Yellowstone from natural disasters, especially wildfires. Fires are common in Yellowstone, usually sparked by lightning. Since 1972, the park has averaged about 24 fires per year, burning nearly 5,000 acres annually. While most fires stay small, some years bring massive blazes. The fires of 1988 stand out as the worst in Yellowstone's history. That year, over 1,200 square miles, about 36% of the park, went up in flames. But here's where beavers come in. Water doesn't burn. Wetlands, ponds, and other water reservoirs created by beavers act like natural fire breaks. These wet areas slow down or stop the spread of flames, protecting parts of the park from complete destruction. So, while beavers might be small, their impact stretches far beyond building dams and shaping habitats. They're also an important shield against some of nature's fiercest threats. Beaver ponds act like an impenetrable shield against wildfires, saving parts of forests and natural areas in the park. There's clear proof of this. Photos from Idaho show a fire near Beaver Creek where everything around was burned, but the waterway and the plants right next to it stayed untouched. The fire simply couldn't burn the wet zone created by beavers. This natural barrier stops flames from spreading, protecting vital ecosystems. Life isn't always easy for Yellowstone's beavers. In June 2022, the northern part of the park experienced an intense storm, 7 to 9 inches of rain in just one day, combined with melting snow. This caused the worst flooding the area had seen in 500 years. The floodwaters destroyed many beaver dams and likely harmed or killed some of the animals. Human activity has also made things tougher for beavers. Actions taken in the last century disrupted the natural balance, leading to fewer willows and, as a result, fewer beavers. Decades without many beavers changed the shape and flow of streams. When scientists watched beavers trying to reclaim certain areas, they saw the animals struggling. One biologist observed a beaver colony moving around, searching for the right spot. Even though there were willows in good condition, the beavers couldn't find the perfect place to build a dam. Luckily, this particular group managed to block a stream and build a pond by 2021. But not all colonies might be so lucky. Some may never find a good spot to settle. The ripple effect on wildlife. Despite these challenges, thanks to the combined efforts of wolves and beavers, many of Yellowstone's waterways have slowly started to heal. Wolves control elk populations, reducing overgrazing of plants like willows, while beavers rebuild dams that restore wetlands. Which of these two played a bigger role in the recovery? It's impossible to pick just one. The positive changes wouldn't have happened without both predators and engineers working together. The process takes time and effort. Beavers have to find the right place, build their dams, and then the ecosystem slowly comes back to life. There is a shortcut, though. People have started building artificial dams that mimic the work of beavers. These aren't huge concrete dams like the ones that can cause harm to nature. Instead, they use natural materials like branches, sticks, rocks, mud, and soil. The process copies beavers' building techniques, but with some differences. Wooden posts are hammered into the streambed, and thin branches from nearby willows are woven between them to create a permeable barrier. Then, mud, sand, roots, and plants are packed in to make the structure strong and close to what beavers build naturally. This method works. Ponds form, groundwater levels rise, biodiversity increases, and the benefits seen with beaver dams happen faster, without waiting for beavers to settle in first. Still, these human-made dams aren't as perfect or well-maintained as those built by beavers themselves. Nature's engineers know exactly how to care for and fix their homes, which keeps the ecosystem thriving. Beavers may be small, but their impact is huge, shaping entire landscapes and helping protect the park from fire, drought, and biodiversity loss. Their work is essential, and when humans step in to help, the results can be just as impressive, at least until the real beavers return to take over again. Beaver ponds don't just protect against fires and help restore habitats, they also play a key role in making ecosystems more resilient to climate change. As weather patterns become more extreme, with longer droughts and heavier storms, these wetlands act like natural buffers. The ponds slow down and water flow during floods, reducing erosion and preventing soil from washing away. During dry spells, the water stored underground in these areas helps keep plants alive when rainfall is scarce. This means that beaver-engineered landscapes can help stabilize local climates and protect wildlife by maintaining steady water sources. The thick willow thickets, supported by beaver activity, provide shade and shelter, which cools down the water and creates comfortable microhabitats for fish and amphibians. In many ways, beavers are nature's climate warriors, quietly preparing the land to face unpredictable weather. The return of beavers also brings a domino effect for many other species. Their dams create wetlands, which become rich homes for birds, amphibians, mammals, and insects. Species like otters, minks, and marsh birds rely heavily on these watery habitats to hunt, breed, and hide from predators. Waterfowl, such as ducks and geese, use the ponds as safe nesting grounds. Even insects benefit because still water in the ponds is perfect for mosquito larvae and other aquatic bugs. While mosquitoes may be annoying to us, they are a crucial food source for many fish and birds. This diversity builds a stronger and more balanced ecosystem, all triggered by the simple act of beavers building dams. It's easy to underestimate beavers because of their size, but they are among the most powerful ecosystem engineers in North America. By cutting down trees and building dams, they change how water moves through the landscape. This creates new wetlands where there were once only fast-moving streams. These wetlands store carbon, filter pollutants, and improve water quality. They also slow down runoff, reducing the chance of downstream flooding. All these benefits show that beavers don't just build homes for themselves, they build healthy environments for countless other species and improve the natural world for all living things, including humans. Despite all their positive impacts, beavers still face challenges. Human development, roads, and fences can block their movement, making it hard for colonies to grow and spread. Sometimes their dams cause flooding in areas where people live or farm, which leads to conflicts. Managing these issues requires careful planning that balances beaver benefits with human needs. Scientists and conservationists are working on solutions such as installing beaver deceivers, devices that control water levels behind dams to prevent flooding. These innovations help keep beavers and humans living peacefully side by side. Beavers are proving to be vital partners in restoring and protecting natural habitats. Their role goes far beyond just building dams. It's about creating resilient, thriving ecosystems that can withstand the pressures of a changing world. So, in the end, beavers are rebuilding ecosystems, protecting wildlife, and even shielding landscapes from disaster, all while quietly rewriting what it means to be a keystone species. But behind all this muddy construction and ecological magic, there's still one big question. What happens when nature's best engineers disappear for good? Could we really keep the balance without them? Let us know your thoughts.